welcome everybody to the second webinar of our global series, Global Migration Governance at a Crossroads, the narrative of global responsibility and its legal and ethical implications. Thank you for joining us this morning or afternoon or evening, depending where you're logging in from. So just to say by way of introduction, this series is co-organized by Ethnicity, Nationalism and Migration Studies, the ENMISA section of ISA, the International Ethics section of ISA, and the International Law section of ISA. I'm Alexandria Innes. I'm from City St. George's University in London, and I've worked with today's discussant, Hans Schatter, and with Marling Hassenkamp, who has really led this initiative to put together this series of webinars. And so it's been great to collaborate on it, and we're really glad to see you here. So the webinar series, just to give you a brief overview, seeks to explore the narrative of global responsibility along with solidarity and sanctuary practices in an era when global migration governance seems to be facing a pivotal moment. From climate change and armed conflict to economic deprivation and political repression, the root causes of migration continue to challenge the international community. We want to focus in on the narrative of global responsibility, not only as a moral imperative, but also as a complex legal and ethical construct. Central to our discussion are and have been two critical questions. What are the limits of global responsibility towards refugees, and how are these limits transcended at the meso-institutional level and the micro-community and individual levels? So today's speaker is Nora Wee-Jung Kim, an associate professor of sociology at the University of Mary Washington in Virginia. Nora has published widely on the topics of refugee movements and experiences, immigration and multiculturalism, including a book that explores the multicultural family in Korea. But today she's going to be talking about her forthcoming book, Sub-Empire's Embrace, Sovereignty and Geopolitics of Asylum in South Korea. And that is going to be published by the University of Hawaii Press in the new year. And so for now, I will hand over to Nora.
Thanks so much. Thank you, organizers, for inviting me to give a talk at this webinar, which is very necessary, especially at this political time. As Alexandria mentioned, I just finished a book manuscript entitled Sub-Empire's Embrace, Sovereignty and Geopolitics of Asylum in South Korea, in which I review the changing refugee landscape of South Korea from the Korean War to Vietnam War, and most recently the war in Afghanistan, and how South Korea's involvement in transitional wars, or like Korea's own wars, have shaped the refugee landscape. And in the book, I talk about, I propose a states hosting refugees as embrace, and I propose 4 different modalities of embrace, which is militarized embrace, surrogate embrace, calculated embrace, and also ambivalent embrace. And today, because of the nature of this webinar and the focus of this webinar, I'm going to present a chapter from my forthcoming book that talks about calculated embrace. And the speakers in the first webinar of the first presentation of this webinar series talked a lot about refugee resettlement as sort of a form of global responsibility sharing. So I'm going to focus on how and why South Korea decided to implement refugee resettlement programs, and what are some limitations, and what kind of insights South Korea may illuminate on global refugee responsibility in the form of a refugee resettlement. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to talk about. So my talk today is titled Refugee Resettlement as Calculated Embrace, the South Korean Case. And I'm also more than happy to talk about different modalities of embrace and why even I conceptualize refugee hosting as embrace, if anybody is interested in the Q&A session. On December 23rd in 2015, 22 refugees, as you can see in the image here, consisting of 4 families, arrived at Incheon International Airport They were the first group of refugees that South Korea accepted as part of its 3-year refugee resettlement pilot program. Officials from International Migration, MOJ, Ministry of Justice, UNHCR, and IOM were there to celebrate their arrival. And since the program lasted, the pilot program lasted for another 2 years, and over the course of this 3-year pilot program, 66 more refugees from refugee camps in Thailand were resettled in South Korea. The Ministry of Justice initially planned to decide whether or not to make the resettlement program into permanent program as opposed to pilot program at the end of the end of the first pilot program, but they decide to extend it as a pilot program another 2 years, which is from 2018 to 2019. And during the extension of the pilot program, 63 more refugees were selected from this time from Malaysia and were resettled in South Korea. The 2-phase pilot program ended in 2019, and as of now, in late 2025, the resettlement program still remains as a pilot program as opposed to a permanent program. When the first resettlement refugees arrived, Kim Young-jun, the Commissioner of Korea Immigration Services, said, "This is an important step forward both for refugees and for South Korea. South Korea hasn't taken a step forward in sharing responsibility as a member of international community." So as you can see in the statement, the South Korea considers participating in refugee resettlement program as part of global responsibility sharing, which is the big theme of this webinar. So I think South Korea provides really interesting case why certain countries decide to willingly jump into more global responsibility sharing. But also it is an interesting case because if you look at this data, the blue line shows the number of refugees recognized and accepted in South Korea. As you can see, in 2015, there are about 100 refugees accepted, and 20 of that 100 refugees were resettlement refugees. So given South Korea's economic status, that 100 refugees, including 20 resettlement refugees, is really small. And as you can see, the number of recognized refugees do not go up that much, and South Korea remains, along with Japan, that one of the countries with the lowest refugee recognition rate. So given that if South Korea is really serious about global responsibility sharing, you would see increase in refugee recognition and refugee acceptance. But that's not what we are seeing in the South Korea case. So that kind of poses interesting puzzle, which is why South Korea, while still very reluctant to recognize asylum seekers as refugees, decide to participate in refugee resettlement program. And here I provide 3 explanations. The first is the global refugee landscape, which is UNHCR's resettlement expansionism. And some of you may be already familiar with this. Second, South Korea's rivalry with Japan as moral leader in Asia. And finally, the European migration and refugee crisis in 2015 and 2016 and ongoing. So combining all these 3 explanations, I pose that South Korea's refugee resettlement is a calculated embrace. And I will go over each of these 3 factors in next slide. So when Ruud Lubbers replaced Ogata as the High Commissioner of the UNHCR in 2001, the UNHCR took on reinvigoration of resettlement. So during the Cold War, resettlement was one of the most preferred solutions out of all 3 permanent solutions that UNHCR designated. But with the end of Cold War, that the value of refugee voting with their vote has decreases, and after that, resettlement became least favored solution. But in 2001, the UNHCR started to promote the resettlement again. And to make resettlement appealing to the Western countries, the UNHCR reframed resettlement refugees as more deserving refugees, as opposed to queue jumpers of asylum seekers. And also, UNHCR made the resettlements as depoliticized and humanitarian endeavor that Western countries can use in a strategic manner. So that using of a strategic manner is really important, and I'm going to talk more about that. And UNHCR also made the resettlement as part of responsibility sharing. Said, according to UNHCR in 2001, a resettlement handbook, that tangible refugee resettlement is tangible expression of international solidarity and responsibly sharing mechanism, allowing states to help share each other's burdens and reduce problems impacting countries for the asylum. And I said earlier, and also in addition to being a response sharing mechanism, resettlement can be used in a strategic manner, especially when states were faced with mixed migration flow, which means that there are amongst the migrants that a state deals with, there are refugees, there are asylum seekers, there are undocumented migrants, and there are labor migrants, and sorting them through refugee determination status can be expensive and time-consuming. But resettlement refugees are already vetted by UNHCR, therefore that Western states do not need to deal with this vetting process, and therefore resettlement can be used in a strategic manner in order to reduce the burden of Western states conducting a refugee resettlement process. So then what's the South Korea's motivation for participating in refugee resettlement and under this UNHCR's new resettlement expansionism? As UNHCR trying to encourage other states to participate with refugee resettlement, UNHCR present participating in resettlement is kind of a honorable badge as advanced countries. So when UNHCR and South Korea has been always interested in increasing its international stature, and that doing a refugee resettlement program can be one of the ways to declare itself as a moral and humanitarian country in global stage. So when UNHCR reviewed South Korea's first resettlement programs, UNHCR concluded that South Korea's participation in resettlement is a natural progression of countries striving for increased role in the global era, and it is a notable advancement and achievement and another milestone in South Korea's emergence as refugee hosting nation. So I want you to draw your attention to the language that was used in UNHCR's evaluation of South Korea's refugee resettlement program. Natural progression, that kind of has a ringtone of this modernization thesis where countries will develop from underdeveloped to more developed countries. And South Korea, as it becoming more developed, that one of the indicators of that more developed status is its participation in refugee resettlement. So refugee resettlement is kind of used as a kind of badge of moral, humanitarian, and advanced countries. And that also ties to buying force of empire status in Asia. South Korea has always been interested in how it's been shown or presented in international states, but particularly sort of as a rivalry with Japan. So South Korea has been kind of lagging behind in terms of refugee policies compared to Japan in many ways. But as one of the refugee activists indicated, that Japan, who signed the Refugee Convention in 1981 and started assessing asylum seeker application in 1982, is ahead of South Korea by more than 10 years when it comes to human rights. So it is very conscious amongst South Korean activists in the field of refugee protection, that what Japan is doing and how Japan is doing. And South Korea, on the other hand, signed the convention in December 1992 and start accepting applications in 1993. So literally, the South Korea is 10 years behind of South Japan in this way. And the activists also said Japan drew a lot of international attention by becoming the first Asian country to accept about 100 refugees for resettlement in 2010. So South Korea is now one step ahead of Japan, and that means that South Korea enacted its standalone Refugee Act in 2013, and that's what the activists were referring to. So enacting standalone Refugee Act is it's a progress in terms of human rights and refugee rights, and then it was in 2013 Refugee Act that provided a legal basis for South Korea accepting resettlement refugees in 2015. Also, these are some statements from a South Korean Minister of Justice justifying why, or explaining why South Korea decided to accept resettlement refugees, which is to do its fair share of international responsibility, again, using the language of international responsibility, but also, importantly, commensurate to South Korea's position as non-permanent member of UN Secretary Council and a member as ExCom of UNHCR. So UNHCR's message of refugee resettlement as a badge of advanced and humanitarian country. South Korea also replicate that image or that message, which is by accepting refugees for resettlement, South Korea is now one of the leading and advanced countries in the world. But also that the rivalry between Japan and South Korea is not on the South Korean part alone. And there has, I talked more about this in my book, there has been sort of, on the part of UNHCR, sort of like encourage the competition or rivalry between South Korea and Japan on the part of UNHCR throughout the history. And this is with the resettlement program, it is also the case. When UNHCR recommended South Korea to take into consideration the lessons from the neighbor's experience, which is Japan's experience, and particularly advising South Korean governments carries out mapping exercises as done in Japan. So asking South Korea, encouraging South Korea to learn from Japan, and also expand that encourages sort of competition and rivalry between South Korea and Japan. Finally, we can see there is European refugee crisis of 2015, kind of explains the precise timing and also the type of set of refugees who are chosen for refugees. As some of you, many of you on this webinar may are familiar with, 2015 was one of the peak year of European migration refugee crisis. So in that year, EU countries received about 2.5 million asylum seekers. Most were from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And the shipwreck on April 19 in 2015, where about 700 refugees drowned, was a wake-up call. So a lot of international members were calling for this is a humanitarian crisis and we need to do something about this. And that's when the South Korea decided to accept the resettlement refugees. Well, there has been a lot of pressure on South Korea to contribute more to the European migration crisis, especially Syrian refugee crisis. Other than making financial contributions, South Korea didn't do much. As you can see here, if you look at the nationality of recognized refugees, including, again, resettlement refugees in South Korea, most of them are from Myanmar or Burma, and some in Ethiopia, and some in Yemen, but not the Syrians are not recognized as refugees. And in 2015 and 2016, a lot of Syrians who were in South Korea applied for asylum, surplus of asylum or refugee status, given what's going on in Syria. But instead of providing refugee status, the South Korea decided to give humanitarian status, where they won't be deported back to Syria, but they are not given the status of refugees. So as you can see on the graph on the left side, that the number of Syrians who are humanitarian holders in 2016 is so more than 90% of humanitarian holders are Syrians. So as you can see here, that Ministry of Justice justified that for not providing refugee status to Syrians, as Syrians are refugees in custodian sense. So we just talk about refugees, but they are not really refugees in a legal sense. So therefore, we are not going to give them refugee status, but since we are a humanitarian country, we'll give them a status holder. But as one human rights lawyer mentioned in his interview with the New York Times, the point of policy just giving them a humanitarian status as opposed to refugee status is to ensure that these Syrians will return home once the civil war is over, so that to make their life not too comfortable while they're in South Korea. And also, as you remember from the image of the first arrived resettlement refugees, they are from Myanmar and, let me take back. So South Korea, while not accepting or recognizing Syrians as refugees, but the Minister of Justice said that by accepting refugees for resettlement, that it will improve the image of South Korea as a country with a high regard for human rights, and in the context where international attention has been paid accepting refugees due to recent Syrian refugee crisis in Europe. And this statement highlights this calculated and selective nature of refugee program. As I mentioned earlier, South Korea is under a lot of pressure and criticism for not doing its fair share with the Syrian refugee crisis. And South Korea refused to recognize Syrians in South Korea as refugees, but they gave them a humanitarian status. But South Korea is saying that, but we are doing our fair share of international responsibility by accepting refugees for resettlement. But then, who are acceptees as resettlement? You can see that these are for all Asians and non-Muslim families, as opposed to Syrian single male that were in South Korea and asking for refugee status. So in that way, refugee settlement program works as a calculated embrace, picking and choosing whom South Korea is going to accept as refugees. So as sort of way of conclusion, I want to think about, when all of us think about what does resettlement mean and can do in terms of a global responsibility sharing. As we can, South Korean case indicated that refugee resettlement creates a hierarchy of needs and deservingness. In South Korean case specifically, the needs of the refugees in Thailand refugee camp were more deserving and more legally appropriate refugees, while Syrians in South Korea, who are mainly first came as migrant workers, they are not as deserving because they are not refugees in legal sense, but they are only refugees in custodian sense. This is not necessarily just South Korea's use of refugee resettlement. UNHCR's strategic use of resettlement entails creating hierarchy of needs and deservingness. As UNHCR Executive Committee in 2001 indicates, UNHCR's experience persons who meet resettlement criteria often quite different from asylum seekers who move on from one country of first asylum, who enter a third country in an irregular manner, or who are seeking to bypass migration controls by using the asylum channel. So UNHCR clearly depicts that resettlement refugees that they recommend are more deserving because they are law-abiding and patiently waiving their chance of being resettled, while asylum seekers are queue jumping and trying to bypass migration controls. And South Korea just simply reuses this depiction of the deservingness and the need that promoted by UNHCR. A South Korean case that clearly demonstrates, and then this was also mentioned in the first webinar that presenters talk about the selective and arbitrary nature of resettlement. As we can see that the Myanmar refugees from Thailand were selected because they are Asians, and South Korea felt more comfortable accepting those refugees for resettlement. Also, in order to avoid accepting Syrians as refugees, and resettlement often devoid of procedural rights and legal remedies. Resettled refugees, even if refugees who are not accepted or selected for resettlement, there's no legal measures that they can appeal to the accepting states' decisions. And finally, mostly newly emerging resettlement countries in global south, like such as Mexico or Brazil, or in periphery of the global north, such as Ireland and South Korea. So as we can see that resettlement, refugee resettlement from global perspective is not really encouraging more global countries in global north accepting more refugees. It is just expanding the refugee resettlement so that new countries in global south or peripheral global north accept more refugees, which is clearly in line with the non-entry regime that where we are seeing here. So I'm gonna wrap up my presentation here, and I'm more than happy. I'm looking forward to hear what Hans has comments on my presentation and also any Q&As. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nora. That was amazing, super interesting, and I am already lining up questions. Before we get to that, can I just say to attendees, if you have a look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see both the chat icon and the Q&A icon. Please could you submit any questions that you want to ask at any point into the Q&A box. And then after Hans offers his comments, we can open the floor and take questions directly from that box. So don't hesitate to input, at any point during the remainder of the session. But for now, I'm going to introduce Dr. Hans Schato, who is a professor of political science and international studies at Yonsei University in South Korea. Hans has published work extensively in global citizenship, refugee policy, and global and national responsibilities. And so, Hans, I'm going to hand over to you for some discussant comments before we open to questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrea. It's great to see you. And thank you very much, Nora, as well, for your, I think, really informative and even groundbreaking presentation. I would just like to say a few words about Nora's book. I have read the manuscript as one of the reviewers of the manuscript. I'm no longer anonymous, since you'll see my name in a blurb on the back of the book. So I'm admittedly a fan of the book, but I'd like to just say a few general words as to what I think the book is contributing when it comes out. And then I'll say a few words specifically about the theme of responsibility as well, just to try to connect Nora's presentation a little bit more with the focus of the webinar series. Nora's book, I would say, is the first full-length academic monograph to focus entirely on the history of refugee policy, specifically in South Korea, and in many ways, by extension, affecting the entire Korean Peninsula as well. And it not only covers the history, which in itself is interesting, but it has a theoretical interpretation as to how that history has developed over the past 80 years. And the book takes us really right back to the founding of South Korea in 1948. Nora was talking about South Korea's sense of rivalry with Japan, and that's significant, of course, not just as South Korea and Japan being neighboring countries, but also with the fact that Japan was the colonial overlord in Korea from officially 1910, but in practice in many ways from about 1905 until the end of the Second World War. And a lot of the early days of South Korea's refugee history is more of South Korea, or the whole Korean Peninsula, actually, because at that time Japan had conquered all of Korea after the former Joseon dynasty had given way. And during that Japanese colonial period, there was quite an exodus of Koreans to other parts of Asia, most notably China and Manchuria, also to North America. South Korea's first president post-war, Syngman Rhee, spent pretty much the whole Japanese period in the U.S., working as an independence activist, and several other key figures in the independence movement that came back to South Korea after 1945 were themselves refugees. And then during the war itself, after North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, just a few years after the US and the Soviet Union had divided the peninsula after Japan was forced out in 1945, there was a very substantial flow of people from North Korea into South Korea during the war itself. So, at a time when UNHCR was initiating itself and focused more on the refugee traffic in Europe after World War II, with all the displacement and migrations going on there, there was also a lot of refugee movement in the Korean Peninsula during that war period. And Nora covers this period very well, and she also looks at length at South Korea's years taking in refugees, or in some cases really not taking in refugees, taking in people, but not incorporating them or not giving them the full protection that refugee status would give, often finding ways to move people out of South Korea as they work their way in. So whether it was people leaving China in the 1960s or people leaving Vietnam and other countries in Southeast Asia in the 1970s that made their way to South Korea before South Korea joined the UN convention and the protocol in 1992. Upon joining the UN itself, there were a lot of people that actually were refugees but were not getting a home in South Korea. And as Nora alluded to in her talk, South Korea's recognition rate is quite low. Even after signing the Refugee Convention in 1992, South Korea still kept its refugee recognition rate quite low. From 1994, I believe, until about 2012, when the country passed its refugee legislation, the acceptance rate was around 6%. And then after the Refugee Act, which a period over the past, say, 12, 13 years, which has coincided, as Nora said, with a great deal of refugee traffic globally for a variety of reasons, including a lot of political turmoil in the Middle East and South Asia and beyond. South Korea's refugee recognition rate has been even lower, closer to 1%. I think the decade-long acceptance rate is only about 1.16. So the application count is very high, the acceptance count is very low, and the Ministry of Justice, which has the jurisdiction to grant refugee status, tends to put a very extreme burden of proof on people applying, to the point where many of them maybe most of them actually, have a great deal of difficulty satisfying the Ministry of Justice that they're actually refugees fleeing persecution, fearful of persecution, and not just some sort of economic migrant. And that's a real uphill battle that the advocacy community here for refugees still faces today. When people, I think Nora referred to migrants, about 500 migrants from Yemen that came in around 2017, they were granted humanitarian status for the most part, rather than refugee status. And I want to bring in another case that's interesting. After the US left Afghanistan in 2021, South Korea was also leaving Afghanistan at the same time period, having been part of the coalition of forces in Afghanistan. And South Korea the military brought back several hundred people that were basically refugees leaving Afghanistan, fleeing the Taliban. And those individuals were taken in. South Korea has had a lot of tension when it comes to people from the Arab Islamic world coming into South Korea. I guess there's a lot of fear and xenophobia, and you could say Islamophobia in the population when it comes to these groups. But in contrast with the migrants from Yemen who were fleeing a civil war that were met with a very chilly reception when they came to Korea, the government went out of its way to accommodate the Afghans, but they framed them not as refugees. They framed them as special contributors. They framed them as assistants to the forces, the South Korean forces in Afghanistan. And they gave them a different track. They gave them a different status for residency that made it easier for them to get jobs. Many of them are working for a Hyundai subcontractor in Ulsan, which is known for car building and chip building. The children of these families were put in schools. The neighborhoods where the families moved in had a lot of concern and resistance and outspoken anxiety at the time, and all kinds of meetings had to be held to help the local people feel more at peace with it. But the families did not find it easier to settle in. But the point that I want to make in terms of refugee policy is they were not labeled as refugees. So the government here is very resistant, it seems, to take in people under that specific category of refugees. And I think as someone who's taught here for actually now 18 years, and has watched the history of this unfold. And I've seen how even after the refugee legislation, which was intended to streamline the system, it didn't have the effect of boosting the success rate of applicants. There's a lot more room for growth that the country can take in terms of really living up to ideas of responsibility or key points of responsibility that we often see in the literature on refugees. I'll just go for about one more minute here, because some of those points of responsibility, like the basis through which countries should fulfill responsibilities, it can come through simply signing the Refugee Convention. It can come through having an economic capacity to absorb more people. It can also amount to a kind of duty of care that countries have whenever refugees enter the borders of a country, typically through airports. And South Korea, as a major airport hub, as a major transit hub, it does get a lot of refugee traffic now that it didn't have, say, 20 years ago. Also, the point that countries, through their present or past actions, have taken steps that cause the circumstances prompting refugees to flee their homeland. South Korea has had histories of involvement with that in the past as well. And also keeping in mind that the interstate system for refugee accommodation can only function well if countries do their bit. Now, that's a problem that my own country, the United States, has to deal with as well right now. It's been, as we have this webinar, the US has taken horrible steps backward when it comes to maintaining the interstate system for refugees. But with that vacuum regrettably created by the US, there is, I think, a role for countries like South Korea. South Korea likes to position itself as a middle power, as a country that's stepping up and doing its bit, not just as a country that exerts influence, but a country that does its bit for the world. And there's a lot more that South Korea could do when it comes to positioning itself as a responsible player in this larger international society. So all these responsibility themes engage actually in very important ways, I think, with the book that Nora's about to publish that will be seeing the light of day next year. So those are just a few additional thoughts on the context of refugee policy here in South Korea. that I hope are helpful. I do recommend Nora's book to all of you very highly as well.
Thank you so much, Hans. That was really great engagement and contextualization. And what I was planning to do was to invite Nora to respond to you before we open for questions. But I think that last point you made sits so nicely with the two questions that we've received already. I'm going to pose those questions as well. And then Nora, if you want to respond to Hans and to the questions, and then we can take some more questions in addition to that while you're doing it. So just to say, the first question was from Tina Mavrikos, and she says, thank you for the presentation. She lives and teaches in Greece, where the entire discourse about migration has become securitized. Here in Greece, irregular flows are posed as a security threat, and due to the geographic location as a frontline country, the government has created policies to restrain migration. So the question is, how can the South Korean case be presented as an alternative response to these migration policies, and what can be applied elsewhere? So that was the first one. And then the second one was from Mark Sprint, who says, to what extent do you think the rise of the far right and nativism in Europe and the US serve as a deterrent to other governments to offer a more open door policy for refugees, as it could serve to put their own governments at risk of facing resistance at home? And so I think both of those questions intersect quite nicely with that final point that Hans made. So yeah, I'll hand back over to you, Nora. And please do to the attendees, if you'd like to put some questions into the Q&A or the chat, please do so. Thank you.
Right. These are two very good, but very challenging and difficult and heavy questions. And I would like to answer the second question first, which is how the rise of far rights in Europe has affecting other countries, especially South Korea. So I want to go back to the example that Hans mentioned, and I also go over quite a bit in my book, which is the Yemenis refugee crisis in 2018. So in 2018, about 500 asylum seekers from Yemen arrived in Jeju Island in South Korea, and that the reaction to that, South Korea's reaction to that, was what we might have seen, or what we have seen in Europe, which is blatant Islamophobia, this idea of a threat to security, and about 700,000 South Koreans signed petition to the government that we should abolish the refugee legislation and also even withdraw from the UN Refugee Convention. So definitely that the European Islamophobia or European response has triggered to the way South Korea is responding. So then it kind of leads to the first question, which is we also see, as the participant mentioned, that a lot of the framing of refugee and asylum seekers as a security issue, securitization. And from my analysis, I would say that would be the case default in South Korea as well, especially when those asylum seekers are Muslims, brown skin. So that's default. So then how can we come up with an alternative? And I don't know if I can answer that question. Really, I've been struggling with that question quite a bit. In the case of South Korea, who are exempt from this securitization framework? Those are historically and contemporary examples suggest that they are the ones who are handpicked and evacuated by the South Korean government. So if you are handpicked by the South Korean government and brought by the South Korean governments, either that we happen, as I examined the case of Vietnamese refugees after the fall of Saigon in 1975, and also the Afghan refugees in 2021. So those groups of people are exempt from securitization framework, mainly because now they are framed as those people who need South Korea's help, or also special contributors to South Korea's military mission in Afghanistan. I argue in my book that it is because rescuing them and then bringing them over to South Korea is one way to legitimize South Korea's participation in Vietnam War and Afghan War, respectively. So then, does that mean that you have to invade a country first to avoid the secretization framework? That's not the answer, right? So I'm kind of stuck in between how can we avoid secretization without perpetuating the creation of hierarchy of needs and hierarchy of deservingness, in order to avoid those refugees, asylum seekers who are exempt from secretization are framed as deserving, which is good for those people, refugees, asylum seekers who happen to be included in the framework. But as sociologists, we tend to think relationally, right? So those who are framed as deserving and contributing to the society, that always creates this the other category of those who are threats and undeserving. So when it comes to think about how can we switch framework from secretization, alternative is clearly deservingness, and also another way to think of it is sort of like bringing in refugee and asylum seeker posting as a reparation to imperial interventions. That's some scholars argue that Western countries has caused this human displacement in the first place. Therefore, Western countries and Japan and South Korea are responsible for those kind of replacement. So that's one way to sort of reframe it. But again, those kind of reframe will, from the examples of South Korea, there will be also this perpetuate the hierarchy of needs and deservingness. That's where I'm stuck, and I would love to I love to hear more about other people, what they think of those issues.
Thank you. And we don't have any more questions at the moment in the Q&A or the chat box, but just another reminder, feel free to put them in there if you want to. But I think, Marlene, you have your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much, Nora, for your nice presentation. Also has great comments. From my part, I think Nora's book provides really a fresh perspective, talking about how resettlement program from emerging north or global north country might do. But I have two, it remains still a little bit confusing for me, Nora. When you talk about from the South Korea, you accept those so-called recognized refugee, right? Refugees who are recognized following, probably, I suppose, following exactly the definition of the Refugee Convention. But concerning with regard to South Korea's government's current treatment toward Syrian refugees, I think it's a paradox, or lots of things which are not inconsequent. I mean, okay, due to the humanitarian concerns, so they are allowed to stay in South Korea, but they are obliged to go back to their home countries when the country is safe, etc. But many of them, they might be submitted to the kind of political persecution and all those justify asylum ground, and therefore I am just questioning you. How do you, in your book, how do you approach or conceptualize those kind of recognize the refugees from a sociological perspective? Is it a kind of specific sociological construction you take? The second question is, You mentioned about the South Korea's, well, I would say, striving for a global reputation as a humanitarian actor or leading humanitarian actor in the region in concurrence with Japan. And there is a kind of vying for sub-empire status. And then it comes to me that it is a very strong, I would say, strong geopolitical or strategical motivation. And therefore, all the whole refugee program may run risk of a kind of a cosmetic program to demonstrate South Korea's power status in the region, right?
Thank you for the question, Melanie. And I'm just going to use my chair's privilege to piggyback another question off that. So I was really fascinated by this idea of refugee resettlement being sort of a status symbol or used in this kind of geopolitical context. But I'm also interested in narratives of like ethics and responsibility. And I wonder on the one hand, this could be considered sort of an alternative narrative to securitization. It's obviously not ideal because it's thinking about status and geopolitics as opposed to sort of the needs or rights of refugees and migrants. But it could be a potential alternative narrative. But I wonder as well, what other narratives could you talk about in South Korea? So is there a sort of strong human rights narrative at all that doesn't look at this status idea, but just sort of makes a case for the ethics of being a refugee resettling country or an asylum accepting country and that sort of thing? Yeah.
Right. Thank you for those two questions. The first, refugee as a legal category versus refugee as a sort of sociological concept. In South Korea, Refugee Convention was introduced, first introduced in 1975 when Vietnamese evacuees are coming from left Vietnam to South Korea, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs trying to figure out who are they, what should we call with them. So it was really, for me as a scholar, interesting to go through archives and how South Korea, who didn't know about the concept of refugees in legal sense, are exposed to UN Refugee Convention. So previously in South Korea, the word 난민 was more sort of like displaced people due to natural disaster or due to wars and things or internal conflicts. So that the word was refugee in South Korea. In South Korean would be now 난민, but before the Vietnam encounter with the Vietnamese evacuees, the word 피난민 was more used, and 피난민 meant the displaced people from mainly from the Korean War. So in my book, I talk about how this, like initially the words 피난민 were more often used in a sense that devoid of the persecution perspective and devoid of you have to leave the country within the border of country. So all these like kind of stipulations that listed in the legal definition of refugees, right? So that were absent in early period, but during the late 1980s and 1990s, as the Western countries generally become a little more reluctant to accept Vietnamese refugees, that South Korean government start to use more restrictive legal definition of refugees, which is you have to be outside of your country, you have to persecute it based upon these 5 reasons, which is race and nationality, religion, and political opinion. And as Hans mentions earlier in his comments, that South Korean government tend to use very restrictive interpretation of what these persecution means. And my own analysis and other analysis by other scholars have shown that the South Korean governments tend to use, so in the refugee convention in South Korean refugee law, that persecution is either past persecution or reasonable fear of future persecution. But in the South Korean case, that bureaucrats and lawyers, judges tend to interpret persecution as actually happened persecution, not considering the reason of a fear of persecution. And because this, a lot of Syrians who were in South Korea who applied for asylum status in 2019 and 2016, they were not given refugee status as a legal status. Only those who are a few, either who worked as a journalist, who have a very strong profile, those are given refugee status. Same thing true with the Yemenis. Asylum seekers. There were about, as I mentioned, there are about 500, and initially only 2 out of 500 Yemeni asylum seekers are given refugee status as a legal status. So that is one of the way how South Korean governments kind of differentiate refugee in a custodian sense, which is closer to 피난민 than what we understand the South Korean Korean War refugees versus refugee in legal sense, which is very restrictive. And in terms of alternative framing, the ethics and responsibility, so when I talk about South Korea's refugee landscape from the 1950s to contemporary, I kind of talk of in addition to talking about as embrace, which is that embrace is like, there is clear hierarchy in terms of the agency of embracer and embraced, which is embracer gets to declare who they are going to embrace, and who get to clear moral superiority of those. And that is not necessarily South Korea's case. The way how refugee convention is written, that asylum seekers, they do not have rights to asylum. They have very passive right of not being returned back to the country where there is reasonable fear of. So therefore, the way how the international refugee regime is perceived in the first place, and the way how it has been sort of used as refugee as a tool to during the Cold War and also the way how it's been using as a sort of security issue in contemporary, I don't know if, without reconsidering the refugee convention and international refugee regime itself, we can sort of go beyond this the power dynamics of the embracer and embraced. And given the limitations of the embracer and embraced, and even if we bring in the ethics and responsibility framework, that becomes very limited, because the asylum seekers basically do not have right to asylum, right? So it all becomes the generosity of the embracer. So when we talk about ethics and responsibility, we're talking about ethics of the embracer and responsibility of the embracer. But the responsibility of as a advanced country, a responsibility as a of humanitarian country, as opposed to responsibility as the country who caused this underdevelopment, unfreedom, and human development in the first place. So I would say that although there is some room in the alternative frame of ethics and responsibility, but that will be the extent to which utility of that kind of responsibility will be very limited, as long as we kind of think of refugee and asylum seeker accepting as sort of rights of the state first, as opposed to rights of asylum seekers.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nora. Really interesting and such a well-considered response, I think. And I hate to cut this off because it's been such a great discussion and conversation. And I have to say, I'm really looking forward to the book coming out. It sounds amazing. So thank you again to Nora for such a great presentation. We have to come to a close now. We're just about out of time. Just to say thank you as well to Hans for such wonderful responsive comments and discussion, and to recognise Kat Volker and Sarah Daw at ISA, and Joel and Hannah, who are giving us tech support today. Thank you for the support from ISA to put these webinars on. And thanks to Mao Ling and Hans for being such great colleagues and collaborating to put this series together. So we look forward to seeing everyone again on the 21st of January for the third and final webinar in our series. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us today.